Hi, this is Jim Humphrey of Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. Let's have a look at the Ross M10 Mark III Canadian Service Rifle of 1913. You'll find a variety of these Ross rifles. This particular one is the Mark III with 1-star M10. The M10 was developed in 1913 for use in World War I for the Canadian troops. This particular one is chambered in .303 British. To remove the bolt action group, I'll disengage the safety of it, put it in the ready position, move the bolt stop to the intermediate position, and pull the bolt right out the back of the receiver. Bolt disassembly is a little more complex. I've got another video for that. I'll put a link at the end of the video and in the comments below. Now that I'm absolutely sure it's unloaded, I can start the disassembly by removing the barrel bands. The upper barrel band here is held in one screw. This upper barrel band also has the bayonet stud and the piling swivel on it. The manual says take off the front sight in order to remove the bands completely, but I found I didn't need to do that. The upper band and this lower barrel band can be put down at the end, and I still get the stock off. The hand guard on top of the stock removes, it's just spring clipped. I can pull it straight off. The stock is attached to the receiver by 3 screws. This stock clamp screw and the front and rear receiver screws. The stock clamp screw has a nut on the back side. I have to make sure that doesn't spin when I'm removing the stock clamp. With 3 stock screws removed, the trigger guard pulls free from the bottom, and the magazine and the receiver push out from the top of the stock. Everything is separated now for cleaning and lubrication. Worthy of note is that inside the stock there's a small nut for the lower barrel band screw. It's embedded. It should stay in there, probably won't. It certainly caused me a lot of trouble when I was trying to reassemble the rifle and get the screw started in that nut. That's the basic field strip prescribed in the manual. The magazine disassembly is pretty impractical, but the other parts of the receiver can be taken apart. If you stick around to the end of the video, I'll go through a little bit further detailed disassembly. But let's start the reassembly here. The magazine goes in first, and the receiver comes down on top of it, and the trigger guard then kind of clamps it all together. So the 3 bolts of different lengths all go back in their respective locations and are snugged up. Careful not to spin that nut on the stock clamp screw. I slip on the upper and lower barrel bands and secure them with their respective screws. Those screws are different. The handguard just clips on the top of the barrel, and I have to align it by pushing it back and forth just a little bit to make sure that the handguard lines up with the groove on the stock for that lower barrel band. I have to be careful with that lower band screw. If I push too hard on the screw, it pushes the nut out of its seat and I lose it, so I have to insert it carefully and get it started before I push on it too hard. I want to move the bolt stop into the intermediate position and look along the sides of the bolt action. There are a couple of rail guides, one on the left, one on the right, and those rail guides engage these two rails at the top of the receiver. So with the bolt pulled out to the extended position and locked in place so that the lugs are horizontal, the gas hole is up. Okay, that looks good. There should be a slight gap between the sleeve and the lugs. Yes. And I'll make sure both the rails are engaged in the rail guides. Make sure I push the bolt stop into the lock position and push the bolt home. So I can do a function check. When I pull the bolt back, I should see a gap between the sleeve and the lugs about 1 inch long. This gap is essential as an indicator of a correct installation. When I push the action forward, the bolt stops in the breech, but the sleeve continues forward, causing the bolt to rotate, which locks the action into battery. When I pull the action back, I should see that gap. Well, that's about all there is to it. There are a few more parts on the back end of this receiver that could be removed for detailed cleaning or maybe maintenance. This older gun here had some parts that were frozen up, so I had to do some more work on it. So we've got the fire control components, the ejector, the bolt stop, the rear sight, and the charger guide and sight base, which is held on with these screws. The charger guide and sight base, these screws are staked, so it's going to be pretty hard to get them off. I left them on, but everything else I removed. So let's talk about some of the parts before I take this apart, get the nomenclature right. In the fire control group, we have the sear spring, the pawl, and the sear pin, and then the yoke and the trigger. Then we have the components of the bolt stop, the ejector, and the rear sight. So we have the bolt stop retaining pin, the bolt stop spring, the bolt stop hinge pin. Then we have the ejector spring, and the ejector pin. Finally, the rear sight pin, the sight spring, and the sight spring screw. Removing the fire control group is as simple as pushing out this sear pin. Notice the sear pin has a taper on one end, so it definitely has to be removed from right to left. That's about as far as I can take it. I can pull out the sear spring, but the rest of these pins are riveted, so the sear and pawl are not going to come apart, even though they have a hinge and there's a spring inside there, the pawl spring. But there's really no way to take it apart without cutting these rivets to push those pins out, which is a destructive method. These parts were rusted frozen when I got it. I really would have liked to knock that pin out to clean it up and get that spring out of there, but just couldn't do it. Same goes for the trigger and the yoke. It's riveted together. Would have been a lot easier for me to clean up this roller. It was frozen solid, and if I could have knocked that pin out, as it was, I had to spin it and lubricate it, just keep spinning it to free it up. So the ejector is retained by a really unusual method. The ejector is spring-loaded and hinges about a pin. There's also its retaining pin, and the pin's in a keyhole slot. So I have to kind of wiggle the ejector to line the keyhole slot up, and then I can pull the pin out, and the ejector and spring follow. So the hole in the ejector, as you can see, is kind of keyhole shaped. And the pin that goes in there has two grooves cut in it, a large groove on the right here and a smaller groove on the left. The large groove is designed to fit up in the keyhole slot on one end, then press up into the smaller end and lock into place. This prevents the pin from coming out. So I have to push the ejector to line up the large end, and then the small groove is for pulling the pin out. Now the spring too is a little bit unusual. See, it's a asymmetric pin, so it's square on one end and tapered on the other end. That tapered end is what's the end that engages with the ejector. The bolt stop has three positions. This middle position for removing the bolt, this top position is normal operations, and the bottom position is the magazine cutoff position. There's little detents on there that this bolt stop retainer pin engages, and that sets each of those positions. To disassemble this, I have to remove that bolt stop retainer pin. The bolt stop hinge pin is spring loaded, and it is this spring tension that's holding the retainer pin in place. On the back of the charger guide base, we can see that there's a hole that fits the back of the retainer pin. So I'll put a punch in there, put a little pressure on the back of the retainer pin, and then remove the spring pressure on the retainer pin by pushing on the bolt stop hinge pin, and the retainer pin will just pop out. Then I can pull out the hinge pin and the bolt stop. Removal of the rear sight is pretty straightforward. There's a hinge pin. I just use the brass punch to knock the pin out. The sight spring is retained by this small screw, but it's actually held in place because it's dovetail shaped, so it has to be driven out of its dovetail. You can see on the sides of the spring here, it's got a dovetail cut into it to lock it into place. So let's put it all back together. The rear sight is a flip sight. It's got two ranges marked on it. Obviously the range numbers have to face back towards the operator. I found because of its shape it was a little bit easier to put in at the 500 yard sight position. And because the spring's so powerful, I use a pair of soft-jawed pliers to squeeze that sight spring so I can line that pin up and drive it home. The ejector spring goes in flat end down and tapered end out, and then I grab the pin so the large groove goes inside to engage the ejector. So the tricky part about this was just finessing the ejector to get that hole to line up. I found using a punch on it, kind of pressing down and wiggling around was the best technique I could come up with. When I finally got the pin to go in, it kind of overshot, so I had to reach up and pull it out just a little bit to get it to click into place. And you can see the ejector's pretty much flush on this face here, and that pin's locked into place. The bolt stop has a flat face on the front end and these dimpled face on the rear end, and that's for this retainer pin to engage those detents. So I have to line the hole up in the hinge pin so I can pass the retainer pin through it. Putting the fire control group back together again, it's just a matter of getting this sear pin in. Notice the sear pin's pointed on one end. It goes through from left to right. Lining all the parts up, the critical aspect was to get the back of the yoke on this ledge on the receiver as I pushed in the sear pin.
Well, I hope you found that interesting. I'm Jim Humphrey from Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. Remember, enjoy your firearms, join the NRA, and be safe out there. Thanks for watching.